Thank you so much. Hola, that's my extent of Portuguese. I wish I could say more. I'm seeing people say boa tarde, and I'm thinking that's good afternoon. So, good afternoon, everyone. It's such a privilege and an honor to be able to speak to you today on this topic. And I'm really, really thankful to you, Prof. Alan, for inviting me. I've known Prof. Alan for many, many years. And this time he invites me to Brazil, but then sends me a Zoom link. He should have sent me a plane ticket, but no problem. I'm sure I'll find my way there. So I do have a presentation for you today on this topic. And one thing I should warn you about, everybody, is that I am a storyteller. I love to tell stories. So in my presentation, I'll be speaking more about stories than speaking as a law lecturer, which explains why I am a director of a research center and not teaching classes anymore, because I tend to just tell stories, and you can tell stories via research. So I'm going to start there. Hopefully you can see. I always have to do that. Excellent. And don't mind me if I switch off my camera. I like to switch off my camera because I don't like looking at myself when I'm talking. So as long as you can hear me, that's great. So you've already heard about who I am. I am the director at CIPIT, and CIPIT is the Center for Intellectual Property and Information Technology Law at Strathmore University. It's important for me to tell you a little bit about CIPIT. We started off as a unit in the law school at Strathmore University, where we looked primarily at intellectual property, which is why it features so much in our name. But after, or rather, 4 years ago, we became an independent research center at Strathmore University. That meant that we said bye-bye to the law school and started standing on our own 2 feet in order to investigate things such as intellectual property, artificial intelligence, data governance, and ICT law and policy. And today I'll be talking to you about licensing of language data for natural language processing in Africa as a part of the broader discussion on the regulation of copyright and artificial intelligence in Africa. And I must say, this is one of my favorite topics to discuss. And why is that? Because I have a thesis, a primary question, which is who owns your mother tongue? And that might seem like a very simple question with a straightforward answer, but this question has profound implications. And it's not just an abstract philosophical question. We've witnessed the rapid development of artificial intelligence, and natural language processing technologies is part of or a section of AI technologies. And the ownership and licensing of African language data has become a critical issue that affects millions of speakers across the African continent. So I want to examine how current copyright frameworks are being applied to language datasets, if at all, and why this matters for African communities, and what we can do to ensure our linguistic heritage serves our people rather than extracting value from them. And I start here with my first story of tonight or this afternoon, which is this slide that shows you a picture, a screenshot from the Financial Times from 2018 that depicts the Maasai. The Maasai are a community that can be found in Kenya and Tanzania, and they are a very well-known African community. They're known for their cultural heritage. You can see their jewelry, you can see their dress, their hair, very popular. And the Maasai have been used as a marketing tool in the global north for a very long time. But the fact that they are used as a wonderful marketing tool doesn't mean that they reap the benefits from the use of their depiction in marketing goods and services. So in 2018, the Maasai actually enlisted a lawyer to battle for their quote unquote brand for royalties that would be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And the same thing seems to be happening with African language processing, with the Masakhane and the JW300 dataset, which I will go into detail a little bit later. So the Masakhane are a research collective, and the JW300 is a dataset that they collected primarily from the Jehovah's Witness website of African languages. And that's me when I was younger, a few years ago, and I was talking about that JW300 dataset. And I want to sort of bring these two stories together to ask, how come it's always Africans on the other end of the stick asking for their cultural rights? Why is it that it's other people who are exploiting these rights without any consideration of the communities that have preserved or curated this culture? So what is the current data ownership regime? It's also quite interesting to note that language, in terms of artificial intelligence, is seen as a data set. And when they think about it as a data set, people are very reluctant to apply copyright law onto these data sets. They want to think about data governance and sort of try and put data governance in a silo and copyright regime in another silo and say that data should be governed by data governance. What does that mean? What is a data governance framework without intellectual property laws that apply to it? Essentially, they really think about open licensing if they do think about any copyright regime. And interestingly enough, they govern African language datasets through grant agreements because funders in the space are the ones who determine how data ownership flows in terms of African language datasets. And developers who are actually an African community, such as the Masakhane Research Collective, and communities, and I've made these two distinct. In terms of communities, I mean the language communities, the actual curators, preservers, the speakers of the particular languages, have little control over what license can be adopted. And then there's this question of informed consent because they want us to fit within the data governance regime, right? And if you even put it within the data governance regime, informed consent as to what ownership structures should apply to the particular data is not obtained from these communities. So even the data governance regime framework fails. There's a lack of acknowledgement of the cultural aspects of ownership of language data. Is language something that is a universal right open to all? Or are certain languages meant to be for particular communities because of the historical questions around how those languages have been curated and preserved? Also about where those languages are prevalent and who would use tools that are utilizing these languages, right? There's a lack of acknowledgement that language is actually a cultural asset because languages in many of the countries or the communities in Africa carry with them sacred rituals, carry with them intangible benefits that cannot be understood by the global North perspective. And they cannot just be seen or reduced to a data set. Then comes the very interesting, wonderful idea of open source that many developers, including African developers, are a fan of. And open source, I must say, I am a proponent of open source, but there's a question between the idea of open source versus the practice of open source in the current artificial intelligence regime. And I sort of talk about that later on in my presentation. This is where there's a lot of contention when we talk about the developer community versus the language community in Africa, and I'll explain why. It also calls into question if we can actually utilize intellectual property frameworks to determine cultural asset ownership. We do know that in the intellectual property regime, that culture has sort of been relegated to its own corner. That's why we have cultural expressions and indigenous knowledge builds and acts and conversations at the World Intellectual Property Office. And while we think that that might be really trying not to deal with the nuances of culture, it also tells us that then we can't just blanketly apply already existing licenses to these types of data sets. So I've thrown in all these questions or all these wonderful facts about what is currently going on in Africa in terms of the regime of current data ownership. But in order to understand the complexity of this conversation, we need to borrow from the developers, the African AI developers, and what they discuss as low resource versus high resource languages. And to do that, I first sort of asked myself, what is the digital language divide? And what does this mean? If you see here, you see that the blue regions represent high resource languages, primarily English, Spanish, French, German, and to some extent Chinese, purely because of number. These languages have abundant digital corpora. They have sophisticated natural language processing tools, and some might say even robust machine translation systems. The orange regions, on the other hand, which includes most of Africa, represent low resource languages. These are languages with minimal digital representation, few computational tools, and limited technological support. And this isn't just a technical issue, but it's a reflection of global power structures. The languages of former colonial powers and current economic superpowers dominate the digital landscape, while indigenous and regional languages are systematically underrepresented. For us in Africa, it means that despite our incredible linguistic diversity, we have approximately over 2,000 languages spoken across the continent. Our languages remain marginalized in the digital economy, and it has real consequences for sectors such as education, healthcare, governance, and economic participation of millions of African language speakers, especially in this quote unquote AI era. The question then becomes, as we work to bridge this gap, to close this digital divide, how do we ensure that African communities maintain control over their linguistic resources? Because this map represents the problem that African AI developers are trying to solve. They're trying to move African languages from low resource to high resource. They want this whole map to be blue, but they're not considering the consequences of moving these regions into blue without understanding what happens to the ownership of language. Now, these numbers here tell us a story. They are sobering, and they tell us a powerful story about linguistic inequality in the digital age. You can see that English is dominant as a digital corpora there. English is the orange graph there. There are 3,902 digital corpora available for natural language processing. This is a massive resource, and it enables sophisticated AI applications, accurate translation systems, and comprehensive language tools. And these numbers are a year old, actually. So this is not even the current number. The number could have definitely increased between when my team assembled these numbers. Kiswahili, which is one of Africa's most widely spoken languages. I'm sure you know it as Swahili, but the correct term is Kiswahili. It has over 100 million speakers, but there are only 75 digital corpora of the Kiswahili language that we know of. Despite being an official language in multiple countries and serving as a lingua franca across East Africa, it remains dramatically under-resourced. Xhosa, with millions of speakers in South Africa, has just one corpus available. think about that. An entire language with a rich oral and written tradition reduced to a single digital resource. And when we look at the natural language processing tools, which are sourced via the digital corpora or are run because of the digital corpora available, the number also drastically reduces. The gaps is even more pronounced. Spanish has multiple translation systems, but most African languages have none. When you go to machine translation, the story gets even more desperate. So these statistics come from reputable sources like Mozilla Common Voice, various language consortiums and academic databases, and it is actually documented systematic underrepresentation. And it means that African language speakers can't access the same technology called benefits as speakers of well-resourced languages. It affects everything from voice assistants to automatic translation, from educational software and healthcare applications. So we are not saying that we do not want African language data sets. We are not saying that we do not want African language corpora. We do. We want natural language processing tools for African languages. The question is, how are we going to get there? So to solve this problem, the Masahane Research Collective, who are a research collective across Africa of AI researchers, data scientists, AI developers, decided to troll the internet to find African language corpora, to build a data set of African languages. And that's how the JW300 dataset came up. They found that there was not enough language data online. They found most of it was in the translation of the Bible, which is another interesting thing if you think about it. That's where you'll find a lot of African text. African languages are oral languages. We don't really write things down. We don't really have a lot of textbooks, but people have the Bible, and the Bible is translated in African languages. So they found the Jehovah's Witness website where there were translations in various languages of the Bible, and they decided to create a data set. It was not a perfect data set. The data set would tell you really interesting things based on the Bible, right? So last 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago at the conference on the state of AI in Africa, we had Kathleen Siminyu, who is one of the trustees of Masahane, giving us a story about how when they use the JW300 dataset to translate something like the dog sat by the tree, the dataset would spit out something in Kiswahili to the equivalent of thy dog sat by the huge tree, right? Basically utilizing the religious text, which was really a funny story. So it wasn't even a perfect data set, but it really was something that they could start working with. It had over 300 languages and an average of 100,000 parallel sentences per language, which if you're an AI developer, that means a lot. So they came up with this data set to create translation models for multiple African languages. And there was a problem. I don't know why they decided to contact CIPIT, but they did. They came to CIPIT and asked us. So we found this data on the Jehovah's Witness website, but we want you to tell us if we can use it. I've never asked them why they came to us to ask that question, but we went to the Jehovah's Witness website and we found there was a copyright notice on the website, which obviously the AI developers did not know what to do with. When we looked at the copyright notice, it explicitly prohibited the text data mining of the website. So it meant that they could not use this data set. When we came back with the news, they said, okay, what can we do? Because we really want to use it. So we came up with a template where they could write an email to Jehovah's Witness asking for permission specifying that this was for research purposes, saying that they were not going to monetize the data set, all those wonderful things that would fit within fair use or fair dealing of copyright. And the answer was still no, they could not use it. And so they had to abandon the data set. The biggest question that I had after that from Masahane was, how can somebody else own our language and prevent us from using it? And I had to say, well, they've collected the language, they've translated it. Translation is one of the rights under copyright, and therefore they can tell you that they're not going to allow you to use this translation that they have. They were not very happy with me. They say normally it's the messenger who's short. I was short by Masahane, because they were very disappointed in terms of using this data set. But they became innovative. They didn't give up. They decided they were going to collect their own languages into data sets. And that's where the next problem came up. So have the JW300 data set in your mind. And then now let's shift to specifically Kenya and see how language can be a wonderful tool in access. So in Kenya, there is Think, which is the Tech Innovators Network, and they worked together with the Kenya government, specifically the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner, to come up with a chatbot that speaks Sheng. Sheng is a very interesting language, quote unquote, in Kenya, because it's a mix of Kiswahili and English. So that's why it's Sha for Swahili and Eng for English, Sheng. Wonderful thing that dynamically evolves with each generation, and you are cooler the more you know the most recent iteration of Sheng, which I am very many decades behind on. But they created this tool because they realized that many innovators who need to register with the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner to understand if the businesses that they have are breaching data protection laws, or even just to understand what is this data protection thing and what is personal data and what can I do and who should I talk to if my data is being violated. They speak Sheng. And so Think came up with a chatbot that actually answers questions on the ODPC website in Sheng. This is a wonderful example of what we can do if we have access to these language datasets and repositories, because we are the ones who understand context and we can build solutions that make sense for us. So this is where we want to head to. And guess what? Think collected the language themselves. Think went to the community, asked them about Sheng, collected data sets, then used the data sets to build this model. There are questions as to whether it actually is artificial intelligence, because just because it's a chatbot doesn't mean it's AI. But I think that's a moot point that the developers can discuss. For me, it's an example of the urgency that we have to use the language data sets. Remember, I talked about funders being in control. When you hear about the collection of data sets, you need to think of the numbers. Several thousands of hours are needed to build a corpus for a machine to translate. We're talking about 5,000 hours, 3,500 hours. We're talking about 100,000 sentences plus, and that's a small corpus. In order to do that, imagine the amount of time you need to record. How many people will you record? Where will you store this data? All these are economic implications of having language data sets. And that's why African AI developers need funding to be able to do this. The Lacuna Fund, which is soon to be defunct, was one of the funders that helped African AI developers in creating data sets. And the Lacuna Fund was sort of an amalgamation of different funders. And these are the funders who contributed to the Lacuna data set, or rather the Lacuna Fund. And why am I showing you this? Because these are the people who hold the power in terms of deciding which language data sets will be collected, how they will be stored, how they will be shared. And you can see that the funding architecture is predominantly external to Africa. Funding comes from outside Africa, with funding priorities and requirements that reflect external rather than community interests. And this creates a dependency relationship where African researchers and communities must adapt their goals and methods to meet external expectations, including licensing requirements that may not serve local interests. And the challenge is, how do we engage constructively with funders while ensuring that African communities retain agency over their linguistic resources? So this is an example of a grant funder who, in their grant agreement, actually required that all the data collected must be released on a Creative Commons zero license, a CC0 license. And a CC0 license is equivalent to a public domain license. I'm sure you have heard about the Creative Commons licenses. I must disclose that I am now a board member of the Creative Commons. And they're meant to really feed what they call the commons, the public domain. Where does knowledge come from? The fountain of knowledge, where we pick from, develop, and create new things, right? Depending on which theory of intellectual property you believe in. And I do think that the Creative Commons licenses have a place. And as you can see, the most open Creative Commons license is the CC0 license. It's a public domain dedication. It is a dedication to the public domain. Creators associated with this have waived all their rights to their work worldwide under copyright law. And African developers were being asked to collect African languages into data sets and commit them, dedicate them to the public domain. Okay, what's the problem with that? The challenge is that when funders push for open licenses, mainly CC0 or even CC BY, which is the Creative Commons by attribution, where others can copy, distribute, display, perform, and remix the work as long as they credit or cite the creator, it means that we've lost control over these data sets. It means that we can no longer participate in ensuring that the data sets serve the problems that our communities have or need. When I've spoken to African language communities, they prefer licenses that require attribution to the community. They prefer licenses that restrict commercial use without benefit sharing. They prefer licenses that ensure derivative works remain available to the community, and licenses that allow for community governance over usage. CC0 does not provide any of those. CC BY meets only one criteria, which is attribution. And it doesn't attribute the community, the language community, it attributes the AI developers that created the data set. And this is what I'm talking about, the attribution 4.0. While attribution sounds protective, in practice, it often means a brief acknowledgement buried in technical documentation. The original community rarely receives meaningful recognition or benefit when their language data generates commercial value. And under this license, a tech company could use African language datasets to develop a profitable voice assistant, and their only obligation would be a citation to the people who collated the language data into a dataset. The community whose language enabled the technology receives no ongoing benefit, but in fact is paying to utilize this tool, because who is going to speak Kiswahili in the US? The tool will come back to this language community at a price, and the community gave it under CC0 or CC BY license. This is where I struggle with AI developers. They say, but open source built the computer engineering industry. It is through open source that we have technology. It is why artificial intelligence exists. And I said earlier that there's open source, the idea, and open source, the practice. So, the current practice, I should say. So, here's a timeline of where open source sort of came from. Could be right, could not be right, we could debate, but some of these timelines are what people agree to. There's the GNU project that started in 1983. Glad that this is older than me. I'm so happy that I'm still young. Then in 1985, there was the Free Software Foundation that came into play. 1991 was Linus Torvalds, who created Linux. And we know what everybody said about Linux being an open system, etc., etc. And we go all the way into 2020, where open source is used in emerging technology like AI. But just because they call it open doesn't mean it is. How many models are actually open? And models that are open, if you could talk about Llama, for example, which is an open model, what are the requirements for you to use the Llama model? Right? So the idea of open source is that people did contribute to the commons, but they had a choice. They did it voluntarily. It did not affect their economic outputs. It did not affect their cultural well-being. These were people who could freely give to the commons because they had more than enough to give, and because they were making the choice to do that. When you come to an African community, collect their language data, but don't give them the choice to volunteer to make it open. Are you really practicing open source ideology, or is this something else? So, yes, we are for open source AI data sharing, but we do not want data colonialism. This is not something that's just from an African perspective. Many authors have written about this. You can see this is just a quick collection that I've managed to ramp up from the internet about open source African and Asian artificial intelligence, which is suffering privatization and exploitation. You could even see generative AI systems are not just open or closed, right? But they tend to focus on whether the development is open, but not really the model itself. So we really need to ask ourselves also if culture, which is preserved, curated by specific people, is meant to be quote unquote open to the whole globe, do they understand what they're doing with this culture? And why? Why is there a sudden need by funding architecture from the global north to access cultural language data and then make it public domain? Is that what is the ideology behind that? So do I have solutions to this problem? I do. I have proposed a few solutions. And it's interesting that these create a lot of problems when I start talking about them. Everybody has something negative to say about each and every one of these solutions, depending on where they come from. But I think that if we had community-based licenses, meaning licenses that prioritize benefits to the community and they address the cultural values of the communities, then that's a great way to sort of deal with the issue of extractivism. It would also be great to have probably tiered licenses that modify current licenses to engage a system where those within the community can access, or those with close community can access, and then those who are purely users and have no community link to the community receive different rights and limitations. We can also say just don't apply CC0. And this would be those involved in funding language databases of low resource languages to do away with the requirement that CC0 licenses and their equivalent must be the go-to. They can let that go. We also need to research. As a researcher, I always have to say more research is required, further research is required, right? To understand the proprietary rights and communal assets, such as language, in the realm of AI, and how they can best serve the communities in the collection of these languages. But also, African AI developers have suggested that there ought to be a focus on the future of language databases that models that they will run on, and how these can be utilized to the benefit of the communities. So AI developers are worried that if they don't collect the data under the current terms, then they won't be able to build models. But the funny thing is that they're not even being funded to build models. They're only being funded to collect data. And I tell them that they have too much talent and too much skill to be relegated to data collectors. You cannot be a PhD in machine learning and you've been relegated to a data collector because you're from Africa. And I did not just talk about solutions. I put my money where my mouth is and created one of the solutions. And I didn't do this by myself. I did this with Professor Chijioke Okori from the University of Pretoria, the Data Science Law Lab. And we definitely did this under a lot of immense pressure from Masahane to come up with an actual license, the Nulite Obodo Open Data License, which is a new license for sharing African data sets. Right now, we're concentrating on language data, but we think that in the future, language might be a flavor of the past and something else could be collected. We've had conversations with people in the pharmaceutical industry who are actually talking about how specific gene data is being collected from Africa and none of the benefits are flowing back. Let's not talk about the COVID-19 pandemic and the whole issue about COVID vaccines, where they were tested and then where they were being sold. So the Noodle license is a tiered license because essentially it looks at local communities maintaining control. It also centers culture by respecting cultural values and practices around language, but also ensures that it enables beneficial technological development of African AI. So the key features are that there's a local capacity and infrastructure development requirement, governance models that center community leadership, evaluation by performance metrics that communities define, and benefit sharing mechanisms built into the license terms. So rather than adapting existing licenses designed for other purpose, we created it specifically with African communities' needs at the center. And we, as the authors of the license, do not determine what the community's needs are. That is determined by the community. So the community can pick the template and decide for themselves exactly what the benefit it is that they want. If they decide that they want a benefit which is $50, we support the community. But most communities actually want a sustainable, community-based benefit from those who are using their language data sets. Secondly, we also push for use by others in the developing world. Developing world and least developed world. I hate that terminology, but that's the only terminology that has been defined and is widely accepted in terms of that map that I talked about earlier, which was the areas with the low resource languages, right? So we understand that it's not just an African problem, and we can share language data across other developing countries and share knowledge. So if you're from any of these developing countries, you can access the language data set without having to pay a benefit. But if you're not from this jurisdiction, if you're from another jurisdiction, then you must pay a benefit. That is determined by the community. And the community also determines how much of the data you can access and for how long. So if you Google licensing African data sets, you'll find our website and you'll find the current iteration of the license. An explainer and summary will go up soon. We also have an academic paper that should be published in July that explains the license further. Now, there are those who have tried to utilize the license so far, meaning African AI developers have tried to utilize this license in conversation with funders. And guess what the answer has been? Oh, we don't understand this license. Oh, it's so difficult to determine who is the community. How will we define the community? Oh, what is a benefit? What do you mean we should pay a benefit? We've already paid a benefit by paying people $5 an hour for their data. Most recently, one funder has threatened legal action against an African developer if they utilize the license. We are waiting for that with bated breath because it will be a wonderful story to tell. And shaming is also a way of negotiating with terrorists. So we'll see how that will go. So we always knew that the utilization of this license was not going to be easy. We also know that we might not want to use an intellectual property regime when we talk about cultural assets, but there is a need right now, a desperate need to find a solution. And this is what seems to work. This is the language that the funders speak. And so we are speaking their language to them so that we can preserve ours. We definitely think that we could get a different solution. There has been another license that has come up inspired by the Noodle license. And this is the Ishwetu license that has been developed by Lalapa. And Lalapa is the commercial entity that was spurned out of Masahane. And Lalapa clearly says that Ishwetu license was inspired by the Noodle license. The only difference between Ishwetu and Noodle is that Ishwetu is only available for African developers, not for developers in other developing jurisdictions. And that's a choice that they made. So I want to thank you so much. I went over time by 10 minutes. But I hope that it was worth it. And I'm happy to answer questions if you have any. Of course, my disclaimer is that I am not an AI developer. I'm just a lowly research academic. Thank you so much for listening to me.